True wisdom is almost always born from the fires of pain and struggle. We share the deep tales of resilience that will inspire your heart and challenge your mind to grow stronger. Hit subscribe now and follow us for your daily inspiration.
They called it a routine restructuring. My manager smiled the same way people smile at funerals. Tight, practiced, aimed somewhere past your left ear. We're moving in a new direction, Claire. Nothing personal, just numbers. I nodded slowly, gathered my things, and walked out of that building without a single tear. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to check in 12 years, was that the entire analytical engine powering their business had always belonged to me. Every contract they'd signed, every client they'd won, every dollar they'd made. All of it ran on my framework, and I had 30 days to decide what to do with that fact. I built the Meridian framework during the 2 years I spent doing freelance consulting after graduate school. It was mine, developed on my own time, my own equipment, with my own ideas, and I had filed the patent before I ever walked through the doors of Calloway Analytics. When they hired me, their then CEO had been sharp enough to read the fine print. He knew what I was bringing with me, so rather than trying to absorb my intellectual property into an employment agreement, he'd done something unusual for a company his size. He'd signed a formal licensing arrangement, separate from my employment contract, that allowed Calloway to use the Meridian framework exclusively in exchange for a modest annual fee that had never once been renegotiated upward in 12 years. It was the kind of oversight that only happens in companies that trust the status quo too much. I had let it slide because I loved my work. I believed in the company, and honestly, I had never imagined I would need the leverage. I was wrong to be that trusting. I know that now. The morning it happened, I had arrived early. I remember that clearly. The way the Austin skyline looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows, all glass and pale morning light. I had coffee in my hand and a proposal on my laptop for a new client engagement that would have brought in nearly $300,000. I was proud of that proposal. I had stayed late 3 nights in a row to finish it. I walked past the open-plan desks where my team was just settling in, past the glass-walled conference rooms, toward my corner office, and my manager was already waiting for me at the door. My manager was a man named Derek Calloway, not the founder, but his son, who had taken over as CEO 18 months ago when his father retired. Derek was 44 and wore his confidence like a very expensive suit. He had never built anything himself, but he had a talent for identifying what other people had built and figuring out how to extract more from it. That talent, I'd come to understand, extended to people. He gestured me inside and closed the door. There was a woman from HR, whose name I never remembered, sitting in the chair to the left. That's when I knew. HR only shows up when the decision is already made, and they need a witness. Derek didn't waste time. He told me that Calloway Analytics was entering a period of strategic realignment. They were bringing in an outside consulting firm to oversee the analytics division going forward. My role, as director of methodology and product development, was being eliminated. They would offer me a severance package, 8 weeks, and they would need my access credentials by end of day. I asked him one question. Who's replacing me? He said a name I didn't recognize. He said she came highly recommended and had significant experience in the field. He said it with the particular tone people use when they mean she cost less. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Okay," him for a long moment. Then I said, "Thank you for letting me know." He seemed surprised I didn't push back. People always expect a fight when they fire someone who has been somewhere for over a decade. They brace for tears, for raised voices, for the kind of messy emotional scene that makes HR earn their salary. I gave him none of that. I shook his hand, I thanked him for the opportunity, and I walked out of his office with my coffee still warm. I didn't go back to my desk right away. I took the elevator down to the lobby, stepped outside into the already warm Texas morning, and stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes watching the city move. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Pigeons argued over something near a trash can. A woman in running shoes jogged past without looking up. The thing about being blindsided by something you half expected is that the shock and the calm arrive at the same time. I had seen Derek making moves for months. Quiet reorganizations, consultants brought in to evaluate efficiency, a few too many closed-door meetings. I had told myself I was reading too much into it. That 12 years of loyalty and measurable results insulated me from the kind of cynical cost-cutting that happened to other people. I had made myself comfortable, and comfort had made me careless. But as I stood there on that sidewalk, something cold and very clear settled into the center of my chest. I thought about the licensing agreement. I thought about the renewal clause, specifically, the clause that stated the license could be terminated by either party with 30 days written notice. I had negotiated that clause myself, back when I signed it, for reasons I had never expected to need. I thought about the fact that every predictive model Calloway ran, every client dashboard they delivered, every proprietary algorithm that differentiated them in a crowded market, all of it was built on the Meridian framework. Without it, their product was a shell, generic, interchangeable with a dozen competitors. I took a slow breath. I did not make any decisions on that sidewalk. That was important. I had learned over many years and a handful of hard lessons that the decisions you make in the first hour of a crisis are almost never the right ones. I bought a second coffee from the cart on the corner, I walked back inside, and I spent the rest of the morning doing what they had asked. I documented my ongoing projects. I created handover notes. I was professional and thorough, and I said goodbye to the members of my team one by one, and I meant every word. My team was the part that hurt. Not Derek, not the indignity of being walked out. My team. There were 6 of them. People I had hired, trained, fought budget battles for. A junior analyst named Priya, who had joined straight out of UT Austin 2 years ago and had more natural instinct for pattern recognition than anyone I'd worked with in a decade. A senior developer named James, who had turned down a better paying offer elsewhere because he believed in what we were building. I looked at each of them that afternoon and thought about what was coming for them. And I made myself a private promise that they would be all right. However this played out, I would make sure of that first. I handed in my badge at 4:30. The security guard, a kind man named Harold who had worked the front desk for as long as I had been there, gave me a look of genuine sadness. "You take care of yourself, Ms. Henderson," he said. I told him I would. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment with a glass of water and the licensing agreement open on my laptop. I read it twice, carefully, the way you read something when you already know what it says but want to be absolutely certain. The language was unambiguous. The Meridian framework remained the exclusive intellectual property of its creator. The license granted to Calloway Analytics was non-transferable, non-publicensible, and terminable with 30 days' notice in writing. I did not send the termination notice that night. I closed the laptop and went to bed and slept better than I had in months. The next 2 weeks, I learned later, were characterized by what Derek described in an internal email as a smooth transition. His new outside consulting firm had sent over 2 people to review their methodology documentation. I heard about it from Priya, who texted me occasionally with updates I hadn't asked for but was quietly grateful to receive. The 2 consultants apparently had spent 3 days going through the documentation I had prepared and asking increasingly confused questions about the underlying architecture of the analytical models. On the 4th day, according to Priya, they had asked to speak with whoever had originally designed the framework. That person was no longer in the building. I spent those 2 weeks being careful and deliberate. I reached out to contacts at 3 other firms, not urgently, not desperately, just warm professional reconnections. I had coffee with an old colleague who had moved to a competitor called Tanner Group the previous year. He was effusive, enthusiastic, and by the end of our second cup had mentioned 3 times that Tanner was in an aggressive growth phase and looking for senior talent. I listened and said I'd keep it in mind. I also made a series of phone calls on behalf of my former team members. I had relationships with hiring managers at several firms in Austin and in Dallas, and I used them. Priya had 2 interviews within a week. James had 3. By the end of that second week, I was fairly confident that every person who mattered on my old team had a soft landing arranged or close to it. Only then did I sit back down at my kitchen table and open the licensing agreement again. I had consulted with my attorney 2 days after being let go, a practical woman named Sandra who had helped me file the original patent and draft the licensing terms years ago. She reviewed everything carefully and told me what I already knew. My position was solid. The framework had been developed prior to employment, documented thoroughly, patented properly, and licensed under terms that Calloway's legal team had approved. There was no ambiguity. There was no gray area. The only question was what I wanted to do with it. I had options. I could do nothing, let the license run, move on, rebuild my career elsewhere, clean and uncomplicated. Or I could give notice of termination, which would set the 30-day clock running and force Calloway to either negotiate a new agreement or stop using the framework entirely. Or I could approach a competitor about a licensing arrangement which would create real market pressure and give me leverage I had never had before. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about the 12 years. I thought about the proposal I'd been working on the morning they fired me, still sitting in a folder on a company server I no longer had access to. I thought about the way Derek had said nothing personal with the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced the phrase. I thought about Harold at the security desk. Then I thought about Tanner Group, which processed roughly half the volume of analytics work that Calloway did, was growing fast and did not yet have a proprietary framework to distinguish their product in the marketplace. I called Sandra and told her what I'd decided. She said, "I'll have the termination notice ready in the morning." I sent it on a Tuesday. Certified mail and email to Derek directly and to Calloway's legal department as the contract specified. The clock started immediately. For the first week, nothing happened. Or rather, nothing visible happened. Priya texted me on Thursday to say that the 2 outside consultants had been in the building every day that week, and that there were a lot of closed-door meetings happening. I replied with a simple thank you and didn't ask for details. I was already in conversation with Tanner Group, not about consulting, but about a comprehensive licensing arrangement that would give them exclusive access to the Meridian framework going forward. The conversations with Tanner were quick and direct. Their chief strategy officer was a sharp woman named Vivienne who had done her homework before our first call. She knew exactly what the framework was, exactly what it had produced for Calloway over the years, and exactly how much it would be worth to a firm looking to compete at the next level. We spent 2 meetings talking numbers and 1 meeting talking terms. The fee I quoted was nearly 4 times what Calloway had been paying. Vivienne didn't flinch. On day 18 of the 30-day notice period, Derek called me. I had been expecting the call. I let it go to voicemail and listened to it over breakfast. His voice had a quality it hadn't had in our last conversation, a careful, controlled quality that told me he was working hard to sound casual and not quite succeeding. He said he'd been reviewing the licensing arrangement and felt there might be room for a conversation about the transition terms. He said he valued my contributions to the company and hoped we could find a productive path forward. He asked me to call him back at my earliest convenience. I called him back that afternoon. He started with small talk. I let him have about 45 seconds of it before I said, "Derek, what is it you're hoping to discuss?" There was a brief pause. Then he said that Calloway was prepared to offer a new licensing agreement on revised terms. He mentioned a figure that was roughly twice what they had previously been paying. He framed it as an expression of good faith. I told him I appreciated the call and that I would have my attorney reach out to review any formal proposal they wanted to put forward. I also told him, clearly and without anger, that I had already entered into licensing discussions with another firm and that those conversations were progressing well. I said I wanted to be transparent with him because I thought he deserved to know the full picture before making decisions. The silence on his end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. He asked which firm. I told him I wasn't in a position to share that. He said he understood. His voice was very flat. He thanked me for returning his call and said he would have Calloway's legal team follow up with Sandra. I said that sounded fine. And I wished him well, and I meant it. I had no interest in watching Derek suffer. I had no interest in watching anyone suffer. What I was interested in was being compensated fairly for something that had always been mine, and that 12 years of working inside someone else's company had quietly obscured. 2 days later, Calloway's legal team sent Sandra a formal proposal. The licensing fee they offered was 2.5 times the original rate. There were additional terms around exclusivity and first right of refusal for new derivative work. It was a real offer put together by people who had clearly spent several very stressful days understanding exactly how dependent the company was on my framework and exactly how little time remained on the notice period. Sandra and I reviewed it together the following morning. She said, "They're scared." I said, "I know," we countered. The negotiation took 6 days, which left 4 days on the 30-day clock. During those 6 days, I also finalized the terms of a separate non-exclusive licensing arrangement with Tanner Group, which Sandra had structured carefully to ensure it didn't conflict with whatever Calloway ultimately agreed to. Tanner would not get exclusivity. I made that clear from the start. but they would get full access, full implementation support, and pricing that reflected the value they were paying for. Vivienne signed the Tanner agreement on a Thursday afternoon. She sent me a bottle of very good wine afterward, with a handwritten note that said simply, "Welcome to the right side of the table." Calloway signed their new agreement on the Friday, with 1 day to spare on the notice period. The new terms were 3 times the original fee, with a structured escalation clause that meant the rate would increase annually in line with the company's revenue. There was an addendum acknowledging the framework as my intellectual property. There was a clause requiring 60 days' notice for any future termination by either party. Sandra said it was one of the cleaner licensing agreements she had seen in years. The morning after both agreements were signed, I sat in my apartment in the same chair where I had read the original licensing terms 6 weeks earlier, and I thought about all the ways this could have gone differently. I could have spent those 6 weeks angry. I could have sent that termination notice the same night I was fired, out of hurt and impulse, and watched the drama unfold without any strategy behind it. I could have fought for my job, bargained, made it personal, made it ugly. Instead, I had been patient and I had been fair. I had made sure my team landed well before I made any move that could destabilize the company they were still working in. I had given Calloway every opportunity to do the right thing before I introduced competition into the equation. And when it was over, nobody had been destroyed. The company was intact, the employees still had their jobs, and the business relationship, though fundamentally restructured, continued. I was not an employee anymore. I was the licensor. There was a significant difference. The kind of difference that could not be undone by a routine restructuring. Priya texted me 2 weeks later to say she had accepted an offer at a firm in Dallas and was excited about the new role. James had already started somewhere new and sent me a message that was 3 paragraphs long and made me laugh twice, one by one, over the following months. The people I had looked after in those quiet 2 weeks sent me notes. They found better things. Most of them did not know the full story of what had happened after I left. They didn't need to. They just knew I had made calls for them, and that those calls had mattered. What I know now, in a way I could not have articulated before all of this, is that the people who fire you have almost always made a simple error of accounting. They look at a salary line and see a cost. They calculate what they believe they can save and they make a decision based on arithmetic. What they rarely calculate, what Derek Calloway had never once calculated, is the full architecture of what a person actually contributes, the systems they designed, the institutional knowledge they carry, the invisible infrastructure of a company's capabilities that lives, quietly and unremarkably, inside a single human being until the day that person is no longer there, and suddenly nothing works the way it should. I had spent 12 years making myself indispensable and then accepting the indignity of being treated as disposable. That was my mistake. Not the loyalty. I don't regret the loyalty. But the assumption that loyalty would be seen and valued and protected by the people at the top, that was the thing I had gotten wrong, and I had paid for it with the Tuesday morning conversation and a badge handed to a security guard named Harold. I started my own consultancy the month after the agreements were signed. I named it something simple and direct, the name of my framework, the thing I had built with my own hands before anyone had ever offered me a corner office or a parking spot, or a team of 6 to look after. It felt right to go back to the beginning of it, to remember that I had made something real, on my own, before any of this, and that no restructuring or realignment or efficiency review had ever changed that fundamental fact. The first client I signed was Tanner Group, through an expanded engagement that went beyond the licensing terms. Vivienne referred me to 2 other firms within the first quarter. By the end of the year, I had more work than I could manage alone, and was in the early stages of building a small team. I hired Priya first. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I thought about Derek sometimes, in the way you think about a difficult chapter in a book you've already closed, not with bitterness, but with the particular clarity that comes from distance. He had made a business decision. He had done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer that looked correct on paper. He hadn't been malicious. He had simply been incurious about what he had, incurious about what it had cost to build it, incurious about the person who had built it and what she had brought with her when she walked through his door 12 years ago. That incuriosity had been expensive, not devastating. I had made sure of that because I had no interest in devastation, but expensive enough that he would think more carefully next time, or at least I hoped he would. the lesson I carried out of it was a simpler one, and I think about it often, especially now that I am building something of my own, with people I have chosen carefully and intend to keep. Value is not the same thing as salary. The cost of replacing someone is never just the difference between two pay grades, and the things that make a company actually work, the invisible architecture of ideas and systems and hard-won institutional knowledge. Those things have origins. They belong to someone. They were built by human hands and human minds and human hours that nobody ever adequately accounted for on a spreadsheet. I know whose hands built mine. I have the paperwork to prove it. And the next time someone smiles that practiced, careful smile at me and says, nothing personal, just numbers, I will smile back, genuinely this time, because I will know something they don't. The numbers, when you read them closely enough, have always told my story.